I was having a conversation with an atheist. He made the argument that everything that God did in Quran and Bible happened in a small place in Middle East, meaning God is unaware of things happening in the rest of the world. The problem with this argument is it's wrong. Now, faith and religion is not exactly the same. Religion is how the societies organize themselves, and they do have a specific starting point in history, whereas faith is your relationship with one God or many gods if you believe. And in this video, I will argue that the faith in one supreme God, the faith aspect of it is universal. Now, the evaluation theory of religion says that in the earliest time, people were animist, believing in trees and animals and spirits to be God. Later, the polytheism developed, and from polytheism, with time, monotheism emerged, and with development and progress, someday people will become atheistic. The problem with this theory is also that it's not true. Now, history, remember, is not black and white. Beneath the black and white facade of history, there are many layers, and I will argue that one of those layers is the universal monotheism throughout history. Let's start with prehistory. One of the giant of ethnographic sciences, Mircea Eliade, did a lot of research on many of the most primitive pre-agricultural societies and find that they believe in supreme creator high God, which is completely opposite to the evaluation theory, because according to that theory, the more primitive cultures should be animistic or polytheistic, and more advanced cultures should be monotheistic, whereas his research finds the opposite data. And Wilhelm Schmidt of Vienna School of Ethnology did similar research all around the world and came up with the theory of primitive monotheism being the first faith of the earliest human beings. Now, his theory is not fully accepted, but also not completely rejected. But people like Yuval Noah Harari or Daniel Dennett, when they talk about the history of religion, they of course just put it aside and not discuss about it. Now, both Eliade and Schmidt did a lot of research in the pre-agricultural societies in Australia, Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And they find that all these people used to believe in one supreme God, who is often has no image and who resides in the heaven. Now let's start with the recorded history. Although India and the Hindu religion is supposed to be polytheistic, but in some of the most ancient scriptures of Hinduism, like Brahma Sutra, we find things like Brahman and transcendent and sublime being as the originator of this universe. And the knowledge of Brahman is only attainable from the scriptures. This Brahman has no attributes, and he is formless, limitless, transcendent. And if we look at some of the monotheistic sects within Hinduism like the Arya Samaj and the Brahma Samaj, and how they interpret their own scripture, we will find that there are lots of parallels with Abrahamic faith and understanding of God. Now go back to China. In ancient China, they used to have Tian and Shangdi, the god, the supreme being, who was worshipped in the temple of heaven as far back as 1600 BCE and before. And although I will not quote everything in these slides, you can pause and read. Philosophers like Confucius talking about Tian and saying things which are very compatible with a modern Muslim or a modern Jewish person's idea of God. Even more monotheistic is the idea of Mozi, another Chinese philosopher from around the same time as Socrates. And again, I will not go through the quotes, but Mozi is saying that Tian and Shangdi, which is the two names of the same god, are actually known from the time immemorial in antiquity. Now let's go to the great Eurasian steppes, where the Turkic and the Mongol people had the religion of Tengrism. Now Tengri was a monotheistic, supreme, non-anthropomorphic creator god. And remember, history have many layers, and one of those layers is monotheism, and the other is polytheism. And in Tengrism, you can find both of these. But even in the polytheistic version of it, Tengri is still the supreme god, the creator god. This is one of the reasons why the Turks, when they became Muslim, the entire Turkish nationality became Muslim, because there was this parallel between their religion and Islam. And so too with the Mongols. Most of them, the vast majority in places like even Russia or Eurasian steppes, became Muslim because of that parallel with Islam. Let's go back to the great Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great, 550 BC. And you have Ahura Mazda, who is the one universal, transcendent, uncreated, supreme creator, who has other names which Muslims even today use, like Khuda, Khudawand, Parvardigar. And interestingly, Khudawand has 101 names. And in Islam, Allah has 99 different names. Now I will give a few analogies to explain all these examples. Even in Islam, before Islam emerged, the polytheistic religion of Arabia, they had Allah as their supreme God. But you have the Arab Hanif sect, which was a strictly monotheistic sect, worshipping only Allah and not worshipping idols. I argue that this example can be extrapolated in many of the faith traditions in history and across civilizations. In ancient Greco-Roman world, you find in ancient Greek people like Hypsisterians, the group that worship the Most High God. And they actually adopted a lot of things from the Jewish people, especially the worship of the Jewish God. And then you have the God-fearers, the Greeks and Romans, who had also although not converted to Judaism, worshipped exclusively the Jewish God and borrowed a lot of Jewish practices. The philosophers like Xenophon, again, I will not read everything in the slide, but his ideas about God, you have a lot of parallels with Islam. Or the mathematician and philosopher Thales, and you will find it difficult to distinguish between his understanding of God and the Islamic understanding of Allah. Or the student of Socrates, Antisthenes, and he was quite opposed to polytheism, and his understanding was quite close to Islamic understanding. Or you have the Neoplatonists, who used to believe in the One, who was the cause of the universe, and it was much more like the concept of Brahman in Hinduism or Wahdatul Wujud in Islam. And Neoplatonism influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'll give you another analogy. Now remember, monotheism not always emerged from polytheism. Sometimes polytheism also developed from monotheism, and we have a historically verifiable example of this is monotheistic Judaism. Through a 300-year-long process, became Trinitarian polytheistic Christianity, where the earliest Christians were strictly monotheist in the 1st and 2nd century, whereas the later Christians became polytheistic and Trinitarian. I argue this can be extrapolated in all these examples I'm giving. Let's go back to ancient Egypt. And 3,300 years back, we find things like the great hymn to the Aten, who is called the only God, like whom there is no one else, who has created the world and who is alone, and he supplies the people with all their necessities. And Aten, or Aton, has a lot of similarities with the Jewish name for God, Adon, Adonai. Now I'll propose that the evolution theory of religion is completely wrong. Monotheism always existed in history, and the prehistoric animism developed into polytheism, and we can find in history non-theism and atheism from some specific period thousands of years back in ancient India and Greece. And I will not speculate about the future, but the idea that atheism is the most developed form of metaphysics is obviously wrong. I'll give you another analogy. In Islam, there are 99 names of God like Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, and many different schools of thought in theology of understanding of God. But can you argue seriously that all the Muslims are worshipping different gods? No, you can't. Similarly, you can't argue that God in Islam, God in Judaism, and God the Father in Christianity are different. So from that analogy, I propose that God is universally worshipped in different names in all the different cultures across societies and civilization in history. He has different names, but we can identify him in history and different cultures. I will end with a quote from Leo Tolstoy, who said, "The idea of God could not have been imagined by human. Such a sublime and transcendent idea is beyond human imagination." That's coming from the most imaginative person in history and the greatest writer. Just think about that.